Right, now is the opportunity for you to make your own contribution to this debate. I have a presumption that there are going to be some roving microphones, but they're not quite ready yet, so I better extemporise. Well, you've heard clearly two very erudite and important speakers. I've got a theory which I'm going to postulate just to get a discussion going, possibly. You heard Dave, I think, end his speech with a clear statement that transport serves, I haven't got the quite words you used, Dave, but serves the cities and is a means of communication for the cities. On the other hand, David gave, in the course of his speech, an example of Dubai, where I would have thought there's a strong argument that without an airport, the city probably wouldn't really exist, and there's a stronger argument, I think, there that transport is fundamental to the development of a current, a living, growing city today. And maybe, therefore, here's a postulation, maybe there's an argument that in terms of creating large cities, it's probably transport that is the driving force. I think it's possibly difficult to see how a major city has grown up without a fundamental transport link of a significant nature, a major river or whatever. But that within an area, I think I probably understand what Dave was saying, that transport then is designed to serve the city that is therefore thereby being created. I'm trying to come up, I suppose, somewhat artificially with a compromise solution to an impossible question. The microphones are now available, but not entirely clear that they're operating, but maybe we'll have somebody, if they'll put up their hand and give them a first test. Can I have a first question from the audience? We have people here who built cities, who built transport, who built cities. Nigel Hugill. Well, no. Come on, stand up, announce yourself.
I was very taken by Dave's point, which was that...
Nigel Hugill, I'm going to have to announce yourself for you if you're going to refuse to do so.
I'm sorry. I'm Nigel Hugill. I chair Centre for Cities and have been responsible for some reasonably big projects in this city, and now actually have a substantial investment in Manchester. But I was taken by the idea that cities have to stand up for themselves, and equally well, Sir David made much of the argument about choices. And what I'm wondering, and if I look, and it's probably the case actually, that it was more the Department of Transport than Network Rail that has an ambivalence about open access operators, the train operators. If I look at that, one of the things I delight in is the fact that there are now rail services to Sunderland and to Hull and Bradford, which have demonstrably had a big impact on those local economies. But what I wonder is, therefore, in making these choices, and particularly if we're going to have a more devolved system, how are you possibly going to arbitrate in that process? Where do the choices stop and the arbitrations begin? And so particularly if you have a more devolved system, so that cities are backing themselves, but they're backing to some extent themselves against each other for this limited resource, which is additional transport capability.
Do either of you want to have a first stab at that? But this is actually a very important subject, and actually, as I said before, a subject which we are trying to take forward. So if anybody's got some observations to make on this, maybe they communicate through Matthew, because we have sent out this letter which is asking our core supporters on this fundamental question as to about how you take decisions in an increasingly devolved structure. But anyway, David.
Well, clearly there has to be money to upgrade major existing infrastructure, and being able to give an operator like Virgin or Stagecoach certainty of the number of train paths they can have on peak hour, on core route, East Coast, West Coast, that's worth a lot of money, and that will bring in a huge amount of money which will allow the railways to be upgraded in that process. But there's this challenge where there's just not enough access on the track. So the system operator role that Network Rail has, which is to act independently to determine on the priorities of applications for train paths, is the process that happens, and there is the protection of the ORR to be able to then opine on whether that process is correct and fair, and whether the open access operator that's applied for that train path, whether they've been treated fairly, and not necessarily just looking at a way of trying to maximise revenue into either department or Network Rail. So it's always going to be a balance, while we have, particularly on the core routes, a lack of access. That's what HS2 does, of course. It frees up 18 train paths on West Coast for start. But you're absolutely right. Those new services, I've travelled on those myself. In fact, I'm going next week on one. They have opened up cities which wouldn't be available.
But David, that's a pricing allocation within the transport system. How do the cities themselves, therefore, influence that? And how do we come to have some sort of evaluation of that broader economic benefit?
I mean, that opens the whole devolution debate, really, when you think about it. I mean, how do you determine the timetables in Wales, or the fare structures in Scotland, and what we've learnt is devolution in both those areas have benefited that. How do you work on the Northern Rail franchise, the awarding of it, the pricing of it? What you've seen is the department has now engaged much more actively with the routes and the regions, and the decisions are made in consultation with the North. And as the North gets more institutional capacity, as London has already, then I suggest that balance of power will shift more and more to the routes, to the regions and the cities, and so it should.
I mean, I think ultimately that it is, as David said, it's about the whole governance agenda. So it goes back to, is it working at the minute? Is it right, through all of the cuts that have gone on, that most of the decisions aren't taken at more of a local level? And I suppose a lot of it will go back is to what are the governance arrangements that are in place within cities, in which the trust and the faith is there to be able to put those more of those powers and the funding directly into the local areas. And the northern cities, and the cities across the whole of England, that is the agenda really, which is how do you do that, both at a transport point of view, health, skills and other things. And I think the argument has been increasingly won that the place to take a lot of those decisions is at the local level, where we can better work together across the agencies. So health is a good example within Greater Manchester, where we've recently been given a lot of the funding then to do that, and immediately we're starting to see a lot of all those local authorities and arrangements come into place to deliver those things. So a lot of it has to be by strengthening the governance arrangements within those cities. The trust becomes there, and it becomes inevitable that locally we're better placed to make decisions, whether it be around transport or other things. Then you have to then develop the business cases within all of those that make that happen. So within Greater Manchester, through our devolution deal, we are looking to move much more towards the TfL type model, whether it be around strategic highways, whether it be around how we better manage bus and rail services and all those other things. It's the natural evolution for cities.
My contention might be that works very well within the city, but is much more difficult to organise if you're talking about transnational corridors. I remember a young man who when he was a young man, came up with the thought that, of course, in the privatisation of Network Rail, or Railtrack as it was, that the subsidy should be paid into the operators and indeed should be devolved. There was a document, I think, produced in February 1993, which forecast that the subsidy should move rapidly from the national government to local cities or regions or to local communities to fund the services that they wanted to buy. And it didn't quite happen that way, but it's much more difficult, I think, if you're planning a national transport structure. Anyway.
So, Simon, am I allowed to add something apart from speaking at the end? Well, I don't know about today. No, I'm still doing this job. What I wanted to say is that actually you can't treat this as a zero-sum game. Howard and Dave latterly and I agreed quite a few months ago now that actually it wasn't going to be a terribly fruitful discussion if actually what he thought he was trying to do was steal some of my money, and what I was trying to do was to protect it against some other city spending it instead. And what we both concluded very amicably is that actually part of this argument is about how quickly cities can develop and how much economic wealth they can create themselves, and in consequence you're not dividing up some central budget in the traditional British government way, but you're actually allowing the places to economically flourish and actually generate wealth which can be fed back into the funding of the schemes. Now, I mean that appears to be that's a central challenge to the British economy, which is one of the most centralised economies in the world outside North Korea, because actually what you're really saying is you can get economic growth in these places, and what we've proved in London over 15 years is that business is prepared to put some of it back. You know, the reason that Crossrail got authorised in the end wasn't a transport argument. It's that business went to the then Chancellor and the Prime Minister and said, we're prepared to put quite a lot of money into this scheme, and by the way, if you don't, we'll all move our head offices to Frankfurt or Hong Kong. But they were prepared to put money in, and the consequence now is that actually you can see that Crossrail is generating huge large-scale development schemes well before it comes. Our only failure has been to not actually to capture enough of that wealth, and Crossrail 2 will certainly do better than that, and indeed we have to, because the target there is for London to fund 50% of it. That's not money that could have been spent in Manchester. That's money that will be derived from property which is more valuable along the line of the route, and I think this is the reason why Howard and I sit in perfect harmony. That's the reason for the Volterra report, which basically says do a wider economic assessment of these schemes, seek to recover as much money as you can from the local development, and then we're not in competition for his transport funding. We're both trying to create economic wealth and grow the economy, and it's self-evident to nearly everybody that it's in these cities that the maximum progress is going to be made. It's not the only place, but it's certainly in these cities that the maximum wealth is going to be created.
And you're going, Peter, to hopefully sum up at the end, but I mean maybe that's prompted other points. Sir.
Thank you. Ben Steele from Sheffield City Region. So I guess I'm slightly nervous about making this statement, particularly with speaking to David. But this is a brilliant time for you to pose the question that you're posing, because HS2 provides a real-time laboratory to assess over time the question that you're posing. And the example is probably very keenly felt in Sheffield, where the city council are a fantastic example of a city that fear what will happen if they don't get a transport infrastructure right in the heart of their city. They firmly believe that transport shapes the future prosperity of cities, and they absolutely fear what will happen if it bypasses them. And as a consequence, if we're clever, we'll understand exactly how much they're willing to pay in order to secure that. And this is a city that is perhaps scarred by letting its retail offer move too close to the M1, too far away from its own city centre. And I think they're not prepared to let the same mistakes happen with such significant transport infrastructure. So a fantastic time to ask the question. I pose it there as a simple question without taking a view on it.
So you would almost propose a bidding war for connection with high-speed 2 or any other infrastructure as between cities. Any other points that people want to... Yes, Steve. Steve Rinsler.
Steve Rinsler, Vision Consulting. Thank you. Can I just take the debate off in a slightly different direction with a couple of points? One is that there's one transport network we haven't talked about, which is data. And data transport is becoming faster and much more connected, and it's not moving passengers and it's not moving freight, but it's moving and allowing people not to work in the centre of cities, but actually to work in smaller units, either at home or in smaller towns. And the second thing is that there's been a total disassembly of a lot of supply chains because people are now ordering online and getting their stuff delivered straight to their home. So the freight networks are beginning to change remarkably and will continue to do so over the next few years. So whilst I tend to be the one that tends to feel that transport has allowed cities to grow, because I come from London and you only have to see the growth of of the way London Underground went, to see the population growth that went with it. Whilst I have always subscribed to that, I actually believe there are other forces at work which will fundamentally change things, and we're at that crossroads or approaching it. I wouldn't like to say we're right at the crossroads, but it's got to be taken into account in the future.
And so Steve, is your postulation that because we can communicate it through big data transfer in a different way, we don't need the conventional means of transport of information, personal communication, and therefore cities will themselves in some senses develop in a different way as a result of that?
If you look at where the big office blocks are around London, and look at who actually is inside them, they may still need to have large numbers of people together. But if you look at the growth of small businesses in this country, they are staying or tending to stay relatively small. And forget the manufacturing side, which doesn't actually sit in the city generally. But the people, the administration and marketing processes do not have to take place in large office blocks anymore. That's my belief.
But I suppose if we're truly rebalancing the economy whilst at the same time growing UK PLC, then cities outside of London need to play a bigger part and a bigger role in terms of employment, housing, and everything. Population increases and the like, and therefore transformational infrastructure, i.e. shiny glass and steel type projects, still need to happen, not least to catch up, never mind anything else in terms of our global competitors. But I completely agree that and thinking about 2040 type timescales, you get into all sorts of things. But data, whether it's movement of data, but more importantly, an on-demand transport that people will clearly be demanding. It's happening in many parts of the world already, but that is what is going to shape a lot of things, which means that I think people will still want to move around and move between cities and all those other things, but I think you're absolutely right. Cities need to embrace data much more than we currently are doing in the UK, otherwise it will be done to us by many of the big app providers. I'm going to
move us on from this debate, because if you are interested in this, you're hopefully may manage to secure an invitation to our next discussion evening, in which we are going to be debating the impact of technology on transport, whether or not items such as that Android, is it, or iPad, or no, it's not an iPad, I'm not very good on this sort of thing, will impact on transport negatively or support transport by making transport more active. Yes, Roger, our most recent Independent Transport Commissioner. And
Roger Madlin. I've had the privilege of spending a rather long time at Argent, developing in Manchester, Birmingham and King's Cross for 15 years. So this is a bit of a mischievous question. I'll probably move away from Nicola and David, actually. If we hadn't won the Olympics, do you think we'd be looking at the value of High Speed 1 for this country in quite the same way? Because I haven't really noticed how much regeneration it's had along its route, other than the obvious things that are happening for us at King's Cross. So thank you very much, the UK government, for putting it into King's Cross. It's a bit of a mischievous question, but I don't see much happening along the route.
Do you think King's Cross would have been the successful development it was without High Speed 1 if still the service trundled along the lines through Kent and wound up an hour and a half later in Waterloo? I
was asked many times how important did I feel that High Speed 1 was for King's Cross, and my honest answer was without it King's Cross would still be a complete pit. So it was the catalyst to get St Pancras working. But as you know, all the transport infrastructure other than High Speed 1 was then put on hold in 2004 until we won the Olympics. So without the Olympics, King's Cross would still be a bit of a pit. We didn't factor in any French or continental companies, suddenly wanting to come to King's Cross. We were wrong. We have had major investments, and we're still getting a lot of interest from major French companies. And watch this space. I have been completely bowled over by how much interest we're getting from France. Now maybe that's because France is such a terrible place to be at the moment. I don't think so. I think that has perfect example of connection from one end to the other. But the question again is High Speed 1 doesn't seem to have done anything.
Are you talking more
other
about
than
Ebbsfleet?
Stratford, which only happened because of the Olympics. Sorry, Nigel, I'm in a very dangerous position here, aren't I? I think Nicola wants to say something.
It was the phrase Ebbsfleet,
I think there are lessons to be learned from what happened at Ebbsfleet and Ashford and why they didn't get to the potential today. Who knows what's going to happen in 40 years' time, but certainly Stratford, there's no doubt that putting the international station there was a big catalyst for Stratford, as much because of the domestic route. And you may say, I haven't seen a lot of impact on some of the lines down there. You should look what it's done to the coast in Kent, to all the seaside cities of Margate and whatever. It's that South East Trains will go on and on to grow, and it's transformed journey time and values and access jobs. And a lot of people live down those lines there.
I don't need to say anything, David, thank you. But in addition, I'd say for Steve, before he says behind me, don't forget Ebbsfleet. There's a huge amount of growth going on at Ebbsfleet at the moment. Paramount Park will open in 2020, and lots of housing, lots of ideas for further growth, which is a great hub of transport development. I think what High Speed 1 does is exactly what we've been talking about now, though, connecting big cities. So it was a global decision to do exactly what you've said, to say London needs to continue to have really good accessible connections on the land between us and Europe. And that's a massive commitment from a nation, but it says London in effect almost as a city-state, it was the Palmyra of its day, is a kind of a sense of we've got to invest in this, because if we don't, we will fall behind. And that is a lot of what we've been talking about, I think.
And I think that, High Speed 1 connects two cities of 8 million people, the two biggest cities in Europe. It's an obvious high-speed network. And High Speed 2 is essentially a spine. That's the way I think of it. It's a spine that starts in London, and it then connects to West Coast and it connects to East Coast. And that's essential because that draws all the patronage and potential from people coming from Glasgow, Edinburgh, Newcastle, Preston, and the area there. And then it has 3 spur lines. It has 3 spur lines to cities of 3 million plus, which is Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester, because they justify it, because they're 3 million people. And then it's the hubs, and it's the hubs of Crewe or the hubs of Oldham Common or the hubs of Sheffield. And what makes those city hubs work is their connectivity. So if we don't integrate them properly into the rest of the transport systems in those regions, the Voltaire model, we need to look far wider than what we do today. We initially say, well, Crewe will affect 2 miles around Crewe Station. No, it won't. It'll affect within 30 miles of that area. Then we need to be able to justify that and understand why but to make those city connections work, whether it be Sheffield or Crewe, we've got to make the other forms of transport really easy to get into those big high-capacity hubs.
We've not heard from, we have 2 transport ministers sitting next to each other, or ex-transport ministers of different persuasions. How does this answer political issues in terms of Andrew or Steve? This is all very...
It's been a very interesting discussion, but rather insular. If I said, which is the city in the world that's been most transformed over the last 10 years?
I think you're going to either have to speak up or there must be something on the mic that's not quite working.
So can you hear me now? Excellent contributions. But if we looked abroad and said, what are the city or cities which you think have been most transformed by transport infrastructure over the last decade besides this one, which one would you highlight? And perhaps that's a question to Peter as well.
I've got it. I'd use the example of France. France is far less centralised than the UK and has a high level of productivity growth in the last 20 years. And I'd suggest cities like Lille and Lyon and others have benefited enormously from the high-speed capacity that those rail services have built to those cities, let alone the German services or the Italian services, what they're doing now. But I think those and they were the subject of your last report that you produced, Simon, which just looked at the growth that came in those cities.
Well, we might ask John to come back on that, but Lucy? Or just speak very loudly, maybe, the answer.
David Joy from LCR.
Right.
The point I would make is that investment in transport isn't necessarily the only element that's required to achieve development and investment around stations. I mean, Ebbsfleet is a case in point, and Crewe, and you can point to other areas, Clapham Junction, where the transport is fantastic, but the development hasn't followed. You need some other elements to draw on and create the opportunity and deliver the development around those stations rather than just the transport investment itself. And I like to think that's what we've been doing at King's Cross and Stratford, and what we're hoping to do with HS2 on the HS2 areas around the stations. Because you do need more than just the investment in the transport and the spine. You need the institutional governance of the development and the investment opportunity to be de-risked for the private sector to join the party. So there is an element of more than just the investment in the transport.
What's interesting so far about the debate, and maybe it's because of the individuals sitting on the podium, is it's all been about rail. Does anybody want to speak up for, how roads and our ambivalent sometimes approach to roads? Sometimes we wish to close them down and put more cycle routes on them. That's a particular view of my ex-chairman, for whose I apologised in the FT only 2 days ago, criticising cycle routes. But what do roads do in this debate? But sir, you had a question or an observation.
Actually, I'm Henk Bouwman. I'm in the team with John Worthington on working on the ITC's report for learning from analogy or learning from Europe. I wanted to make a slightly different point, actually, looking at this question here just in front of me on the screen, your question. And I think two aspects. I think the aspect of time I did not hear that much about, and I think when you look at examples in Europe, as you also, Sir David, pointed out in France, I mean, it took them, they started in 1964, first decision. I mean, it takes at least 2 generations to sort of mature and really see the impact. It takes a long time to bring in this kind of infrastructure like HS2, and then again it takes a long time to sort of really affect economy or economic development or whatever. So I think the aspect of time is very important to understand, and that it can change, that things can change. I mean, 50 years in France meant that halfway internet came. I mean, it wasn't there. Nobody had a clue in 1964 that, what internet could do. So those kind of things, I think, are very important to understand. And I think the other thing is, the word I hear a lot is HS2 or HSR being catalyst, and I would almost argue that it's maybe rather a spark to ignite a spirit of change. When there is no spirit of change in a city, when cities don't want to sort of change or develop, and we have seen examples in Europe, like for instance in Avignon, I mean, nothing has happened actually. And actually the first generation, the first bit in Lille, where they brought in this high-speed train, because the former prime minister was, by accident, also the mayor of Lille, so it went through Lille. I mean, there you could see that in the first bits actually nothing happened because of the train, or at least nothing happened what they had planned. And now you see that the spirit of change, the sort of spirit that they really want to be part of, is really sort of boosting almost let's say the opportunities for high-speed rail. And I think in Manchester, I think there are cities in the UK as well where you sort of feel this kind of spirit of change. And I think those cities, when you have this spirit, I think then HSR can ignite. If the spirit isn't there, nothing will happen. You have a fantastic connection, and like in Avignon, a huge parking place, and that's it. Which, by the way, is maybe also very interesting to have, because there's a lot of English people going to Avignon, take a car to their country house in summertime, so it serves something. But
we are looking at this very much from a city perspective. So maybe that's not.
Sorry.
Oh my gosh, we've suddenly got a plethora. You've got the brightest shirt, Steve. So, Jim, rather, I beg your pardon, sorry.
Thank you very much. Just probably following on from that, but some of the earlier comments, which are looking at transport and the great hubs it creates, and inviting the question of how we're going to challenge the development around them. I just invite you to look hard to your left at the big shiny tower block visible on the horizon, which is really an example of the other way round, and it illustrates the point I want to make. So down there's Canary Wharf.
Yeah.
It's irritatingly 2.5 miles away from the kind of financial core of London. But it was set up 30 years ago. 30 years ago that didn't exist. And its development was led by the private sector. The transport system and it rather worried the planners of the day, kind of followed on behind it. Actually, somewhat reluctantly. I can think of some august organisations that rather opposed providing the transport for it because it was kind of irritatingly the wrong way round. Here was the market saying, we wish to develop that site, triggered by enterprise zone and goodness knows what, and believe me, we'll put 100,000 people to work there. We need a transport system for it. Now, that's market-led demand, and this country and this city has that spirit, actually, to do that. At the time, arguably, it didn't. The City of London was very opposed to development. It soon responded to that, and you've got a completely different situation since. It is 30 years ago, but my question really is, and it goes back to the report that Sir Peter mentioned, the Volterra report, and the issue of bringing in private sector money, which has happened already in London. I have a business, we'll pay a little bit towards Crossrail. It's fantastic. Businesses in general are already paying towards transport investment. My question is there the strength of the business demand in the north of the country to achieve the same thing?
There you are. Dave.
Well,
put up or shut up.
Well, as I said, cities have to. Cities have to back themselves. So, you know, in terms of looking at examples of transport funds that will have come forward, they're a mixture of funding, largely, has to be said, public sector funding. You know, and we each have our own growth poles and growth centres, and places like Media City in Greater Manchester is an example of a place that has risen out of, you know, a major regeneration of an existing port area. And likewise, there are similar examples that you could find in Birmingham and Sheffield and various other places, clearly at a different scale. I think the opportunity that things like HS2, Trans-North and other things present to those cities is the opportunity to truly intensify developments in particular parts of cities, and to do it in connected places, or where there isn't connections, that those connections need to actually come in place. Clearly, through the devolution agenda, through the work that will be done around the delivery of HS2 stations, there are opportunities to look at different funding mechanisms and strategies. But I think part of the Volterra piece was, I think, playing back to what you were saying, Jim, around Canary Wharf. It was almost like, you know, there are clearly risks in planning infrastructure based on ambition, but on the opposite side, there are massive risks if we fail to put in place the infrastructure that's sufficient to drive demand, growth, and those intensifications that need to take place. So yes, there are risks, but that's why the whole look at the appraisal system needs to fundamentally change so that there is a truer reflection of how you balance those things out. And again, as I go back, we are playing catch-up in a big way in lots of parts of this country.
Okay, shall we just take a few more questions in probably relatively rapid succession, and then let the speakers conclude, and then Peter conclude the conclusions? I'll just go round sort of in a sweep. Sir.
I'm Lawrence Barth. I teach in the Graduate School of the Architectural Association, Urbanism. And I'd like to come back to Lord Adonis's question. I think this is a key one where we begin to ask the question, from where do we learn? And just like to put a couple of possibilities forward. Recently, many of us here have been paying a lot of attention to Malmo, and it has a number of characteristics that we might want to consider carefully. A turnaround city, it's a peripheral city. It became even more peripheral because of the collapse of its main industries. And decisions about transport taken in conjunction with its competitor and collaborator, that is with Copenhagen. We're very, very key to seeing a future ambition for the city. transport was very key to it, but so was a wide range of government initiatives that have essentially turned the city around. Now, it was looked at in a very integrated way, where the regional question about the competition collaboration networks was really central to their consideration about how the city would develop in concert with its main competitor, Copenhagen. If we compare, by contrast, southern Taiwan, where we've got a high-speed system that begins to link the entire network of cities that make up the bulk of Taiwan's economy, there was a tremendous opportunity for Kaohsiung and Tainan to begin to form a pole to, in a way, balance southern Taiwan against northern Taiwan. But they missed that opportunity because they couldn't think in terms of competition collaboration networks that would have positioned Tainan and Kaohsiung as collaborators and competitors within the same system, and use transport as part of that. So I think one of the things that we really want to do is to investigate those areas where the lessons are not only about the transportation infrastructure itself, but the lessons for how government engages its civic infrastructure to deliver joined-up thinking about the possibility of collaboration as well as competition at the same time.
So rather Peter's point that one should collaborate rather than fight over pots. Yeah. The lady in the back, I think, had a question or observation. We must keep these short, otherwise there won't be any time for drinks. No, that's fine.
Okay, I'll try. Pam Alexander, Design Council CABE and Academy of Urbanism. I really wanted to make David Joy's point again, which is that transport is a necessary but not sufficient route to economic growth and social vitality. And I think in answer to the question that's tabled, transport will only come to cities which have not just ambition but capacity to fulfill that ambition. But it won't be enough to grow that ambition. And in relation to Ebbsfleet and Ashford, I think they are a case in point. Actually, Ashford has benefited hugely from HS1. It's grown all of its economic growth, its housing growth, on the basis that it's now 19 minutes into central London. It's actually developed hugely in terms of design. It's been able to completely redesign its centre. That's been very important. It may not be the most important town in the country, but it's been very helpful. And I think one of the big challenges for regional growth is going to be how those that are not obviously going to immediately seize the benefits of HS2 and all the other offshoots, but those that are actually going to need to be supported. And we need to identify what the barriers and the different elements are that need to be brought together so that we can really focus on where the opportunity is and where the barriers are and where they can be supported both by the private sector and by the public sector.
So a mixed economy, a mixed economic. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex Jan from Arup. My question is, how do we deal with the conundrum of the fact that on the one hand we're expecting users to pay more or a increasing amount for these services, on the other hand we want them to provide these economic benefits. So if you take High Speed 1 for example, the narrative around High Speed 1 was in part about regeneration of deprived, underdeveloped parts of East Kent, and yet High Speed 1 fares, actually the commuter fares that on the trains that use High Speed 1 are some of the highest in the southeast. There's a premium attached to using those services, and yet they're serving some of the communities with the lowest disposable income in the southeast. So how do we avoid our new schemes, which are designed to lead to regeneration, being so expensive that they price out the very people we're trying to assist in the cities that they're serving? Right,
a good question maybe that Peter, who has his own, when he conclude, will touch on? Or, okay. No, or, yes, when you come to conclude. Anybody else want to make some observation? One last, yes, sir.
Hello, Christian Bocci, Weston Williamson architect, working on many rail projects around the country. My question really is about how we integrate different modes of transport and how that feeds and works in with the the point that Peter made earlier about each city being able to make its own case for growing and using the transport that it gets to increase its commercial viability effectively. I make the analogy with Japan, with the high-speed network, where they look at things like the ports, how those work with the transferring of goods around the country, how the roads integrate with the system, and each of the systems, each of the transport systems we put forward in this country seem to be their own business case for their own mode, rather than integrating with other modes and how we work that out as a country. My question really to the panel is whether this independent mode for business cases is correct, or how we actually look to integrate these modes, because it's quite a difficult issue to deal with, I think.
That's, to a certain extent, music to our ears, because one of the tangential observations we've made in the work in connection with Airport Commission is that there seems to be one Airport Commission, one high-speed rail initiative, and it's not entirely clear that there's been dialogue. So on that point, maybe I conclude the questions, and maybe before we move on to the sort of finale, which is the two speakers just having 2 or so minutes each to make their own observations, we could just thank the two ladies who've not just passed the microphones round, but have also set this up bright and loosely. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I try and go back to some of the points that I tried to draw out as well during my presentation, and what also has been said, that I think we're starting some way back, and therefore we have a lot of catch up to actually play to bring us back to a place that we really need to be. I do accept that major infrastructure is going to be required in substantial ways in order to drive the UK economy and the economies of our city, but I also do importantly believe that data and technology is going to be a huge shaper and changer going forward. As a keen commuter and leisure cyclist, I would also argue that cycling has a part to play in modern global cities, and I think we do need to embrace all modes of transport in doing that. I think finally, part of it is it goes back to bits around the work that's being done on the transformational big projects in this country that are game changers and hopefully opening our horizons to what needs to happen. But that point that the city of yesterday can't drive the city of tomorrow. We need to move forward and drive forward this country and our cities.
And I would say the lessons we learn of that choice between choice and necessity, we've been playing catch up now too long on our national transport infrastructure, and it's very expensive when you do play catch up. When you're trying to redevelop London Bridge with 50 million people coming through it a year, and you're essentially going to knock down the whole station and still keep it functioning, it's incredibly difficult and it's very expensive. Therefore, there's no alternative but to have a national transport strategy which sets out where ultimately you want all forms of transport to be planned together.
Peter, the podium is, are you going to do it? Yes, the podium I think is yours.